Hi, it's Peter Chapman, and I'd like to welcome you to another SKU Food Recipe for Success presented by FCC. This week, we're going to start our four-part series on the numbers. And I know for some of you that can be really exciting stuff. And for other people, it's a little bit, I'm going to force myself to work on it. And that's fair because we all have different strengths that we bring to our businesses. But the best food and beverage businesses are the ones where you really are able to focus on all the different parts of the business that are important. And if you aren't really strong at a certain part, then you want to try to supplement that with somebody who really is good at it. And the numbers is an important piece because the reality is that if you don't focus on the numbers, then you're going to probably leave dollars on the table. And that's a shame given all the hard work and effort that's required to run a successful food and beverage business. So this week, we're going to talk about gross margin and markup, which are two terms that often, unfortunately, people interchange, and that's not the right thing to do. They are two very different things, and we're going to dive into that today, and I will explain to you how a 35% markup is different than a 35% margin, gross margin. So we'll spend some time on that, and I also want to leave time as well to have some examples because I did bring my whiteboard today. So if you have some questions for me, then I can write them down on there and we can figure it out. So because the math is important and it's important to make sure that we're all on the same page with what it is. So, and that's part of the reason that at SKU Food and partnering with FCC that we do our recipes for success is to be able to be interactive and provide opportunities for producers and processors in the food industry to ask questions. And the purpose of these is to really try to help you manage through some of the challenges in your business. And we know that 2020 has definitely been more challenging than a lot of other years with all of the issues around the pandemic, and lots of people are facing a labor crunch and lots of different things that make it a different year. I think every year is a different year now, but 2020 has been one unlike any other. So we're here to help, and that's what SKU Food is really all about, is helping producers and processors and try to give you tools and insights to help you build relationships with your customers better and ultimately get your product on the shelf and into the shopping cart. And what I try to do is to use my knowledge. I started working at a store back in the 80s, and I learned right in that store how important it was to take care of consumers and really, do the best to to service them and also to get them really on board with what you're trying to do. And that's something that in the food industry, we really need to focus on, and customers and consumers. And so after my time at the store, I went and worked for Loblaw companies for a number of years and had the privilege of running marketing and advertising, and also then moved on to the merchandising side of the business. And I'm going to share, I'm just going to put my headphones in here so that you can hear me better. That had the privilege of running some of the fresh departments. I'm going to share a little story today about that. One of the things that happened to me with regards to gross margin and markup. So one of the great things about our recipes for success, which are presented by FCC, is the partnership that we've been able to develop with FCC, and we certainly appreciate their support to bring these sessions to you every week. And FCC are really work throughout the entire value chain in the food industry. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with their support of the agriculture industry over the past many, many years. But now FCC really do work with people at every stage in the value chain in food. So they work with producers and processors, they work with wholesalers, distributors, work with companies who are connected to the food industry like packaging and other suppliers. So they really are well connected. And that's one of the great benefits of FCC, is they really have a great sense of what's happening in the industry from one end to the other. And also they work with small artisanal producers right up to large multinational companies who are exporting. So they really do have the ability to service a diverse array of customers. So it's exciting for us to partner with them and work on our recipes for success with FCC each week. And let's start talking about gross margin and markup. I'm just going to get you some slides because it is a topic where it's important to be able to share some numbers with you as well. So we're going to talk about how they're not the same. That's the first thing we're going to cover. I'm going to talk about markup. So we'll start with markup, which is really what suppliers are most familiar with, which is what a lot of suppliers in the industry work on. And then also we're going to talk about gross margin, which is really what your customers, what the retailers use to figure out retail pricing. And then we'll talk about some examples, and I'll show you how we can twist those formulas around and make them useful for you with lots of different. I'm not a great calculus person, but lots of different iterations of those formulas. So first of all, I just want to share with you that it's not uncommon to get these things mixed up, and it is something though that when you do know the how each markup and margin is calculated, that you will really come across as understanding the industry, and also your customers, the retailers, will respect you for understanding, how they do things as well. So when I worked for Loblaw Companies, as I mentioned, I managed marketing and advertising in Atlantic Canada for a few years, and then one day, as happens sometimes in the large retailers, they call you in and you're thinking, okay, something's going on, there's something going to change here. And so they said, Peter, we'd like you to work in a different part of the business. We want you to take responsibility for produce, deli, home meal replacement, floral, and seafood in Atlantic Canada. And I was like, oh, I guess I'm going from spending a lot of money and in the marketing and advertising side of the business to making a lot of money on the merchandising side of the business. And it was a great opportunity, and it was a great chance for me. My team went from about 12 or 14 people up to about 30. And it was really exciting to think of the chance to learn something new and really, move the business forward in some of the fresh departments, which we had identified as great opportunities to differentiate our stores relative to the competition. And so the first thing we did was we had a meeting in one of the stores, and we brought all of our retail specialists in, and they had reorganized the merchandising department. So they had taken myself from marketing and advertising to the departments I mentioned. They took the person who was managing grocery and put him into meat and bakery. And they put the person who was our CFO, and he went in to manage groceries. So it was a really big change. And the three of us were walking through the store, and the fellow who took over meat said, I'm a little intimidated by this because I'm new to meat, and I couldn't go out in that meat room right now and take a side of beef and cut steaks or roasts or anything. It's not my background. I mean, he was actually an accountant, and I said to him, well, you know what, I'm happy that I have produce, because at least they have all those little stickers with the numbers and the names of the fruits and vegetables on them, the little PLU stickers, so I can figure out what's what. So it was a big change. So our first pricing meeting, and obviously pricing is really an important component of retailers, job, and that's how we would generate our revenue, based on our proper, correct retail pricing. And we went into a meeting, and we were talking about celery was actually the item, because I remember it very clearly. And our cost was $1.25 per unit of celery. And in produce, our shelf margin at the time, our target margin was 42%. So I said, perfect, we can be 179. And our group of specialists, and these are all people who would have been on my team, they're kind of looking at me like, who's going to say it to him? And one of them, and I'll never forget, it was Tom Rainsborough, one of our specialists, came over and said to me, Peter, you're using markup, not gross margin, to calculate the retail. And here I was, responsible for these departments, and I was calculating it wrong. So we can all do it. And I learned my lesson that day. And from then on, I figured out how to calculate gross margin, which was our calculation on the retail side. So it can happen to anybody. And that's what the produce department used to look like when I was there. They've changed a little bit in terms of merchandising and signage and that kind of thing. But that's what it looked like the day that I was probably calculating it as markup and not gross margin. So, but I did learn my lesson, and I was always thankful for Tom coming in and mentioning that to me. So that, it does happen. And we're gonna clarify a lot of that for you today in our session. So before we get to markup, though, I just want to first of all thank everybody for joining us today. I appreciate that your time is valuable, and we do want you to ask questions. So as I go through some of these things, by all means, I'd like to, invite you to use the chat or the Q&A, and you can ask questions and we'll get to them for sure. I'll take a break a few times. And also to say thank you for being here. And Susan, who works with me at SKU Food, has recorded the first 50 people to log in, and we're excited to send you one of our SKU Food profit wheels. And this is a great tool that you can use in your business. And I'm going to show you how it works a little bit later. We've also got a video on our website that you can have a look at that explains how to use the profit wheel. But it is a fantastic tool to really help you calculate markup and margin very quickly. You can do it in the store, wherever you're at. So thanks for being here, and we'll send that out to you promptly. We'll have to be able to get your addresses, but we'll contact you about that. So that's for the first 50 people who logged in today. So thanks for being here. So let's talk about markup. And markup is what is generally used by suppliers in the food and beverage industry to arrive at their selling price. And you have a lot of different complexities in your business, but one thing that you definitely should know is your cost of production. And that is something that, as a food producer or food processor, you definitely should spend the time to make sure you have a great understanding of your COP, of your cost of production. So the formula, and we're going to dive into each component of the formula, but the formula to calculate markup is your cost of production times the markup percentage that you're going to use, or 1 plus the markup percentage, and that should equal your selling price to the retailer or the distributor or whoever you're going to sell your product to. So let's dive into these components. And we're going to use an example where the cost of production is $2.80 a unit and the markup is 55%. So we're going to talk about each of these components. So the cost of production. And again, this is something that you really do need to make sure you have a really good handle on this, because it's one of the most important numbers in your business, and also managing that cost of production, whether it's 280 or perhaps how can you get it to 275 or something like that. Because if you can save that 5 cents, then you sometimes can put that in your pocket. So the cost of production should be developed by looking at all of your direct costs. And again, I'm not an accountant. I would, as I said at the outset, you always want to surround yourself and have strong people in areas of the business where you're not strong. So I would, in my business, always make sure that I have the opportunity to work with a very good accountant to make sure that you're doing things properly. But to get your COP, you really need to look at all the direct costs that are involved in production and or processing. And that could include ingredients, other inputs to your product. It could be, sometimes there are things that you use in processing that help, and that sometimes you even have to pay for water to push juice through a line and that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of inputs that you need to factor in. You need to make sure you include your packaging, and not just the product packaging, but your case pack and everything that's required to get that product delivered to the destination. You also need to factor in labor, and you need to factor in any processing costs. So all those direct costs should go in to understanding what that cost of production is. So that's an important starting point for you. And those are, for the most part, they're variable costs, because if you produce 10,000, you need this many. If you produce 100,000, you'll need not quite 10 times probably, but you'll definitely need more. So those are the variable costs that you have to produce your product. Now let's talk about the markup percentage. And this is always a challenge in our industry, and because there is no right answer. We can't say you should always use this percent or you should always use that percent. It's really something that you need to determine for your category, for your area of production or processing. There are a lot of different factors that go into figuring out what that markup percentage is. But the costs that need to be included in it are things like your overhead, your sales and marketing costs. And that's one thing from my experience. There are two things that people underestimate when they try to figure out their selling price. And one of them is your sales and marketing costs. And that is something that we in the food industry, unfortunately, and it's not my fault, we've trained consumers to look for products on what we call TPR, temporary price reduction. So you need to build in to your selling price the opportunity to discount your cost of goods to your customers. You need to build in things like participating in their loyalty program or whatever it is that's part of your sales and marketing that's going to get that product off the shelf and into the shopping cart. So don't underestimate that when you're calculating this markup percentage. You need to have the min in there. You need to factor in taxes. And the other one that people really underestimate is distribution. And sometimes when we start small, we go, well, I'm going to do it, or, you know, we're going to have so-and-so's going to drop it off and we're going to tag into this and that, which is fine. But you should always, within your markup percentage, you should always factor in what is the real cost of distribution. So what would it cost you to take a pallet or half a load or a full load to the customer? And that can be to a warehouse, or if you're going to do your product direct store delivery, DSD we would call it, then you need to factor in what's it going to cost you to go around to all those different stores. And again, sometimes people, when they start small and they're distributing to a few retailers, they don't factor in enough of a cost for distribution. So I always challenge people to make sure that you have enough built in there for distribution. And I put it in capitals because I think we always want to make sure that we do factor in enough for profit as well. And you know, there are some food and beverage processors who are doing things which is more of a cooperative mentality or a you know, public service, which is fine. But most food and beverage are businesses that people want to generate a profit. So you need to make sure in that markup that you have enough built in for your profit as well. So the last component of that formula that I shared at the beginning was your selling price. And it's not just a calculation. You need to look at that selling price when you take your COP and multiply it by 1 plus your markup percentage. You can't just say, okay, that's it. That's what the number is. That's what it's going to be. You need to look at it and say, okay, what's it going to be relative to my competition? And I'm going to share a little bit later how you can figure out the costing of your competition when you're in the store. And then also you need to look at it and say, what kind of a retail price will that translate into? So if you're going to sell your products in a category where the retailer's margin is going to need to be, say, 28%, then they're going to increase your cost of your selling price into them so that they achieve that 28% margin. If you're in a 42% department, like I referenced earlier with produce, then that retail is going to be different. So you need to think through, okay, what does our selling price, how is it relative to the competition? And also, what does it translate into as a retail price? And your customers are going to do that same work as well. So you should do it before you get to your customers and be ready for what they're going to, how they're going to challenge you on it. So let's take a look at the numbers. I told you we were going to use 280 as our cost of production. We're going to use 55% as the markup. So you can see if we use that formula that we end up with a selling price to the retailer of $4.34. And that's the kind of work that you need to do in your business to arrive at that proper selling price. So challenge, is our COP as accurate as it can be? Are there any opportunities to reduce it? And then what's the markup required to cover all those other costs that I mentioned? And is that selling price relevant in the market compared to competition? And is it relevant in terms of the retail that will end up being put on your product in the store? Is that a retail that's going to get your product to sell? So that's how we calculate markup. And a lot of work that needs to be done on the supplier end to make sure that you have the right numbers in there to do that accurately. So you also have to say to yourself, like, what are the sales going to be at $4.34? Are they going to be 1,000 units or 5,000 units? Because that's what helps you figure out some of those, what that markup is going to be. And we do have to do that, look and do those kind of sales projections and say, how many will I sell? Because if you're looking at, say, your utility costs, which are probably fairly static, they might be somewhat variable depending on what you're doing. But if they're fairly predictable, or say your rent, then if your rent is $1,000 a month and that's spread over 2,000 units, that's one number. If your rent is $1,000 a month and it's spread over 10,000 units, then that's a different number. So you need to really look at your sales and say, what will they be when I sell that product into my customers? So you can see that when we take our $4.34, which is your selling price, and your $2.80 cost of production, and you end up with $1.54 per unit, is that going to do what you need it to do? Is that going to cover your costs, and is it going to deliver your profits? So that's the kind of question that you need to ask yourself. And it's looking at that and working and saying, okay, what is right with each of those three numbers, and will that $1.54 per unit cover what you need to cover? And out of that $1.54, what are the things that you have to pay every month, like your utilities or your rent or taxes, those kind of things, and how much do you have left to use for sales and marketing? And then how much do you have for profit aside to make sure that you can either reinvest in the business or pay yourself, or however you want to look at profit. So those are the kind of things that we need to challenge ourselves on when it comes to looking at markup. And before we get to gross margin, I'm just going to see, I think I do see a question here. From Ron, how does MSRP relate to these numbers? Okay, so MSRP, which stands for Manufacturer's Suggested Retail Price, and a lot of times we see that where a manufacturer, processor, producer will look at what their cost is and suggest a retail. Now, I can tell you from my experience on the retail side, I was never a big fan of people who came in and told me what they thought the product should sell for. Now, I will give you two answers to that question, but my first answer is your retail customers do not want to be told what the correct retail is to sell a product. They view selecting the retail and making that decision as their role, not the supplier's role. But, and here's the big but in that one, you always need to have the answer to that question. So when the retailer looks at you and you're sitting across the desk and they say, what do you think it should sell for? You need to have an answer to that question. So that's why it's so important for you to understand what the gross margin is that they're expecting. So we're going to talk about that in the next few minutes. But to get to an MSRP, what you really need to do is take that selling price. So if we go back to our previous example, which was $4.34, you need to be able to project the category margin on that and come up with a suggested price if and when your customer asks you about that. And that's a big sort of if and when. So just make sure that if your customer asks that you're ready to answer the question, but my advice would be don't push them into a retail. So let's talk about, I'm just going to look and see if we have any more questions. I don't see any more questions. If anybody does have any questions about calculating markup or anything like that, then now's the time to enter them in. I mean, I'll take a look at them after too, but if you have any, be happy to answer those right now. And if not, I'm going to continue on and we're going to talk about gross margin now. And gross margin is what retailers use. And it's important to know that that's their language. They think about gross margin, and every one of these items that you see in this category has a gross margin that they're trying to achieve. And one thing retailers try to do is they work towards a category margin. So they would have a budget, just as I referenced earlier, where I said that our produce category margin was 42. So we were trying in our shelf pricing in produce, our regular everyday pricing, to achieve a 42% margin. And that is how we would have built our budget. And that's what we would have been judged on, whether we were able to achieve that 42% margin. And if in this category that I have up on the screen, which is pancakes, I'm sure perhaps their shelf margin, maybe it's 28. So if you're looking at the Aunt Jemima Original, because that might be a more competitive item, they might only be making 23% because they are matching somebody's price at $3.79. If you look at the Aunt Jemima Buttermilk, maybe that's an item that they're not matching, and so maybe they're making a little bit more than their 28% margin. And usually the control label or private label products, and that word is synonymous. So here it's a Sobeys store example, so those are complements products, and they would probably be making a little more than the category margin on the control label products because there's no sales and marketing built in from their vendor for those products. So that's how the retailer, they're looking at, but in the end, they have to put all those gross margins together. And it's not just a simple average of the gross margins because you have to factor volume in. And at the end of the day, they're judged on whether they achieve that 42% margin across their category. And next week, in our October series on the numbers, we're going to talk a lot about retail pricing. We're going to talk about gross margin and category margins at retail. And I'm going to share with you how what retailers are expecting by department for gross margins. And we're also going to talk about contribution margin, which is something that as a supplier, I know we get frustrated when we hear that their gross margin was 42%. Well, they don't make 42% profit. That's the gross margin they make. So I'm going to show you what that retailer's P&L, and I'm not going to give away any big state secrets, but I am going to walk you through a mock profit and loss statement just so you can understand what they're really left with at the end of the day. And so we're going to look at retail pricing, we're going to look at gross margin, category margin, which is the same thing to the retailer, and then we're going to look at contribution and help you understand those things, because I think sometimes, for me anyway, it's easier to accept things when I understand them. So I'm going to show you how that all comes together. So let's talk about that formula to calculate gross margin. And again, this is a three-part formula. So we can, if we have two parts of the three, we can always solve for the other one. So I'm going to set the formula up for you as a supplier, because that's what we have usually on our recipes for success presented by FCC. So I'm going to show you how you can expect or sort of how to calculate what you think the retail will probably be. So gross margin is calculated by taking cost of goods sold, which is exactly your selling price. So a supplier would call it your selling price, which is always delivered. I always want to remind people that it's your selling price is a delivered price to the warehouse or to the store. So getting back to the formula, it's the retailer's cost of goods divided by 1 minus the gross margin percent that they're trying to achieve, and that will determine the retail price. And so you can use that formula. You take your selling price, your delivered price to your customer, and you divide it by 1 minus the category margin they're trying to achieve or the gross margin they're trying to achieve, and you'll see what retail price they would be most likely to select for your product. So if we take our $4.34. So you did all your work to produce that product. Your cost of production was $2.80. You marked it up 55% to cover all those costs that we talked about. And you've agreed with the retailer that you're going to sell it to them for $4.34 per unit. And they're trying to achieve a gross margin of 35% in the category that you are selling into. So let's talk about cost of goods. So the retailer would always try to negotiate this cost. It always will be a negotiation unless you have a special deal. So you can always expect to have some kind of a negotiation to that cost, and your customers will always push you on cost of goods. That's just the nature of their business. They feel if they can reduce the cost by a nickel, that they've done their job, or a dime, or whatever. And when they calculate their retails using cost of goods, they always use the everyday, what they would call everyday low cost, or the everyday price. It's before any ads get layered on or anything like that. So it's what is the, we'll call it the regular price, the everyday low cost that they are paying for that product. And then also, as I said a little bit earlier, it's all about delivered costs. So you have to make sure that you remember it's delivered cost. So that's their, how they would be looking at cost of goods sold. And then gross margin, or category margin. And again, those words are synonymous. You can use either one when you're talking to a retailer. What's the gross margin you're trying to achieve? What's the category margin you're trying to achieve? They would look at it the same. And so the way they determine that, and I'll use my 42% in produce example. So when I was managing the produce department, we needed to generate a gross margin of 42% on our shelf sales to be able to pay to operate our department. So that would include all of the staff that we would have, and supplies and fixtures and those kind of things. It also goes towards, part of it goes towards operating the store. So that big box that they built, and paying to keep the lights on, and paying to do the taxes, and all the things that they pay to keep that store running. Probably some of it goes in to pay a store manager, an assistant manager, and the receiver that unloads the trucks. And then also there's a percentage that they need to operate their business, the admin part of the retailer business, or the head office part, or all those different components of their business that really don't get applied to a specific department. So human resources, for example, or finance, or those kind of things. So all those kind of things have to be covered by that gross margin that the retailer is making. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. So I don't want to get too deep into it, but suffice it to say that that gross margin that they set in that category is to cover those three things, plus they need to generate a profit. And so that's how they look at that gross margin. And then when it comes to the retail, so again, it's looking at the cost of goods, applying a category margin, almost the same thing as when a supplier looks at their markup formula. You have to assess whether that final result is acceptable or not. And this is where sometimes you'll get a challenge from the retailer, because they're going to say, based on that cost of goods that I'm paying, the $4.34, and my category margin, the retail is not acceptable. And the way that they will sort of make that judgment about whether a retail is right or not right is they'll say, first of all, is that the right price on the shelf that's going to maximize sales and profit? And we know food, there's elasticity in food pricing, so consumers will buy more in theory when the price is lower, and sales will slow down as the price goes higher. But it's also, there's so much more. It's about value, it's about trust, it's about your product performing, it's about food safety. There are all kinds of factors that go into that decision the consumer makes at the shelf. Am I going to pick up that product and put it into my shopping cart? But we have to remember that the retail price is one of the most important things, and probably the retailers give it more importance than some other, like perhaps you even as a supplier would. But the reality is it's their store, and we have to respect that part of it. So they're going to look and say, is that the retail price that's going to maximize my sales and profit on that product? The second thing they're going to look at is they're going to look at competition. And depending on how impressionable your item would be, the retailer will make a decision and say, I have to be the same as my competition on that product. Or if it's a discounter you're selling into, they may say, I have to be lower than my competition on that product. Or if it's a conventional store, they may say, oh, you know what, it's not the number one item in the category, it's the number 2 or 3 brand. I can be a little bit higher than my competition. So they're always going to be looking at that, where your product sits relative to the competition. And then they're also going to look and say, does it match my category strategy? And a good retailer has a category strategy where they're looking at it and they're saying, okay, the number 1 brand I'm going to use to drive traffic, I'm going to put that on special more often because it has the power to bring people into the store. Whereas the number 2 and 3 brands, I'm going to use those to generate a little bit more cents per unit profit. So maybe my retail can be a little higher. And then where does control label fit? Does it need to be the lowest in the category? Or if I have a premium control label, can it be in the middle somewhere? So they should be looking at their category strategy. So when they take your cost of goods and they factor in their category margin, their gross margin that they need to make, and come to a retail, that's the kind of decision that they're looking at. And again, we're going to dive into retails and how they set them and more next week. But it's an important thing because it's not just taking your cost and applying a margin and saying, okay, that's going to be the price and we're going to stick with that. So that's, it's important that people kind of understand the work that they do to go through with that. So before we get into the numbers here, I just see there is a question. So I'm going to just take a look. And so it's saying, just out of curiosity, would a butcher in the meat department be a cost applied to the department or in the store? That one, the employees working in a specific department would be applied to that department. So the gross margin in the meat department would reflect the amount of service. So if they have butchers who are a higher skilled type employee that are more expensive from an hourly perspective, then the gross margin in the meat department would have to reflect that they have that kind of labor. So yes, they would look at those employees as a cost in that department, and the gross margin would reflect that. So, so let's talk about how we calculate this. So we're going to take our $4.34, which was the selling price after the product was produced and marked up. The $4.34 was that selling price. So the retailer would say, okay, that's my cost of goods sold. and I'm trying to make a 35% margin in the category. So it's 1 minus 0.35, so 4.34 times, or sorry, 4.34 divided by 0.65, and the retail will end up being 668. So that's the math behind that equation for gross margin. And that's what a retailer would do. And that's what you can do with your product. You can take that category margin, which is by all means a fair question to ask your customers. What margin are you expecting to make in this category? And they should share that with you. So the retailer will look at that 668, which is not a retail we would typically see. And a lot of times we would say that in merchandising, there's art and there's science. And the science would be the formula. Then comes the art, which says, is 668 a price people are going to buy at? And so they may round it down to 649, which means they would make less. They would sacrifice some of that category margin. Remember when I showed you the pancakes and I said some of the items are probably a little higher margin, some of them are a little lower margin. Or if that item is a less impressionable item, they may take the retail up to 679 and make a little bit extra margin that they might choose to invest somewhere else. So they're going to look at those retails and they're going to say, okay, 649, 679, what's right? Some retailers go on 677 because they feel like 2 cents cheaper than the competition people are going to pay attention to. You can make your own decision whether that makes any sense or not. But the reality is that they're going to take a look at setting the retail within probably that range between 649 and 679. And again, they're going to look at it and say, is it going to generate the sales and profit I need based on that space on the shelf? How is it relative to my competition? And where does that 649 or 679 fit within my category strategy? And that's the thought process that they're going to go through to figure out what that retail is. So I told you I was going to share the how to use our SKU Food Profit Wheel, and I'm just going to shut down the screen sharing for a moment. So when you receive the Profit Wheel, those of you who were the first 50 to join us today, you'll see that there are actually 2 halves to the Profit Wheel. And I just have to hold it still here so that you can see it. But on one half, on right now the way I'm holding it, it says margin of profit. So that's the gross margin side of the profit wheel. And if we flip it over, you'll see where it says profit markup from cost. So this is the side of the wheel that I explained first with the markup. So if we go back to our example, which I told you that the cost of production was $2.80. So you can see there's a little arrow that says cost each markup. And you'll want to put that right on the 280. And you'll see on the outer ring, it goes right from 1 cent or $1 or $10. You can put the decimal wherever you want, all the way up to 950. So you can really do any number on here. So we're going to put the cost each markup at 280. And we said that you wanted to have a markup of 55%. So we're just going to follow around on this inner ring until we get to 55. And there is our selling price at $4.34. So this profit wheel is a really handy tool to help you figure out what your selling price could be. And it's also a great tool if you're in a meeting with your customer and they say, well, 434 is actually too high. We really can't be 434. What if we're 424? And then you're like, oh, is that going to give me enough? And you can take the 424 and you look at your 280 and you say, okay, at 424, I'm only going to be making 52% markup. Or what that is per unit, is that enough to cover all those costs? So you can use it to determine some of that. Now, when we look at margin of profit, so then on this, when we flip it around and we find the arrow and we go to the 434, because that's the retailer's cost of goods. Let me just get it here, set on 434. And we said the category margin would be 335. So you can see right on that wheel there, when we put the, I'm just going to get it there so you can see it. When we put the cost arrow right here at 434, and then you follow around to the 35% gross margin they want to achieve, and it shows you that that selling price is around that 668 that we said, and they'll make that decision between 649 and 679. So, and we will send you a a link to a video that shows you how to use the profit wheel. But it is a fantastic tool. I love standing in the store and you're looking at a retail on the shelf and you're saying, okay, I know the category margin is probably around 30% here. The retail is $4.49. So that means probably the cost of goods on that product is just around $3.10 or $3.14. So it's a great tool to be able to use when you're looking at things in the store. So I look forward to, if you have any comments about the profit wheel, then we'd love to hear what you have to say once you receive it. But it is a great tool, and we always want to share those with people because I think it's something that can be very effective for people. So I'm going to go back and just take a pause right now to see if there are any questions or not. I've covered a lot of math with markup and margin, and also I'd be interested if you even just type it into the chat. Is it clear for you in terms of how to calculate markup and margin, the differences between markup and margin? Excuse me. So if it is clear for you, then that's fantastic. I'm doing my job. But if you have any questions, I'd love to hear about it. They are different, and it's important to make sure that we do know the different terms when you're talking to your customers. So I'm just going to go back and go to some more examples. But as I said, I'd love to hear if it's clear, if you're seeing what it is. So as we started with the markup formula about cost of production times 1 plus the markup percent equals your selling price. So here, what we can do if we change how we do the formula, we can end up showing you that the markup percent also can be your selling price. So if your retailer says to you, we can only pay you $4.20 for that product, and you know that your cost of production is $2.80, then it will tell you what that markup percentage should be if you solve for that side of the formula. And also on the gross margin side, we started with a formula that said that it was the cost of goods sold divided by 1 minus the gross margin, or the category margin, would equal the retail. Well, if you want to flip it around and solve for the gross margin, you can do that. So that if you know your cost into a retailer and you know the retail price that they're selling your products for, then you can just easily calculate the category margin and then you know exactly what are the gross margin they're making on your product and what they expect to make in that category. And then you can also take that if you want to understand your competitor's product's selling price. Say your product is selling for that $6.49 and you have that 35% margin, and you go in and you see your competitor's product on the shelf for say $5.99. So what you can do, you can solve the formula like I have it there, or you can use our profit wheel. And I said it would be $5.99 with a 35% margin. And that would mean that they are probably paying $3.90 plus or minus for that product. So it's possible to do some different things with these formulas when you know how to use them and learn something from when you're in the store for sure. So we do have a question there that says, are sales taxes left out of this calculation since those are carried through costs? So that's correct. Sales tax would not be part of the calculation. And when the retailer's calculating what the retail would be, they don't think about tax. They think about that as happening after that. So, so that is definitely the way it would be. Can we email the formulas, especially how to clip the calculations to work them backwards? So sure, we can put that in our follow-up email. I'd be happy to include them. And I know that when we go through them here, and we have a limited amount of time because I appreciate you're all busy, but we can definitely put those formulas for calculating markup and gross margin into our follow-up email. Sure, that's a great suggestion, Anita. Thanks for making that. So I don't see any more questions. I hope that you're kind of seeing how this all gets calculated. And some of the things that you can learn from it. And it's gross margin and markup are integral parts to our food industry, and being able to understand what's going on and really make sure that you are speaking the language of your customer. And that's something that I'm a big advocate of. I think that retailers put a lot of credibility into suppliers who can, the way I term it, speak their language. And it's not that they own the language or anything like that, but it is a really important factor that when you go in and you're having your meetings with them and you're talking to them, that you really come across like you understand what's going on in the industry, that you understand the differences between some of these terms that we use, and really don't confuse them, because if you do confuse these two formulas, then you can end up getting yourself into some problems, because if the retailer expects you to calculate, that they're going to need to make a certain margin and that's the cost they're going to expect, then you can't use markup to calculate that. You have to use the gross margin formula. So really want to make sure that you understand the terms that they're using. And if you're not clear, make sure you ask the question, or find somebody that can help you answer the question, because it is so important to speak the right language when you're talking to your customer. And that's part of the reason that I'm excited about next week, where we're going to talk about retails and how retailers determine them. We're going to talk about those category gross margins, and we're going to talk about contributions. Then on October 21st, we're going to talk about temporary price reductions. And as I said, that's a big part of the food industry. We really have trained consumers. I know if you look at Nielsen numbers, you would see that close to 1/3 of volume gets sold on temporary price reductions. So we need to factor that into your selling price. And then also, what are the right things to bring forward for discounts? Should you offer this much or that much? And what should the retailer kick in? I mean, it can't just be all the supplier, right? So we're going to talk about temporary price reductions. And then in the last Wednesday of October, we're going to talk about some of the other costs that you need to consider when you're planning in your business. So distribution is one of them. We're going to talk about distributors and what role they play, and then also what they can, what kind of costs they bring to your business. We're going to talk about brokers as well. They're not the same thing. Again, those are two terms that unfortunately sometimes people use interchangeably, and they're really not. So I'm going to shed some light on distributors, what role they play, what you should expect to pay for that service, and then also brokers on what role they play and what you should expect to pay for their service. And some people even use a model with a distributor and a broker. So we're going to dive into that and talk about that. So we really hope you can join us. If you haven't registered for our October series, I think Susan can probably put the link in the chat for you so that you can have access to sign up. And we try to make it so that it's easy to do it once instead of having to do it every week. And we've got some great sessions lined up in October, and probably going to look and see if we can find a guest as well to join us one of those weeks. So I don't see any more questions, so I hope that everybody did get the essence of the difference between markup and gross margin. And I see the link there in the chat from Susan, so thank you for putting that in there, Susan. So if you want to take advantage of that, then great. As I said, we will reach out to everybody about the profit wheel so that we can get your address, because we have to send those to you in the mail. And I'm just going to finish up, as we do every week, with some good news. Oh, I do see maybe there are some more questions here. So let me just take a minute to take a look at them. So this is from Ron, said, so when in selling beverages to provincial liquor stores, and yes, that's a slightly different world than food retailers like Sobeys or Loblaw or somebody like that. You have to set the sales price that includes the store's mandatory margin. And that's right, a lot of the provincially run beverage alcohol retailers would say our margin is going to be X, and you need to factor that in. And he's saying it's a set amount for beer, but then however, by law, he has to sell in the product the same price in his own store. And yes, beverage alcohol does have some specific regulations around it for sure, which as being a supplier that you really do need to make sure that you're familiar with. And that's I think the point for me on that is that it's so important to understand your customer and understand who you're selling into, because if you're selling into Costco, then you have to do it differently than if you're selling into, say, Sobeys or somebody else. So it's really important to understand your customer. And in that example, Ron's one of the provincial beverage alcohol retailers, then you have to understand your customer there and know what what their rules and regulations are. So thanks for making that point, and agree with you. Also, let me just check and make sure that I see that Susan did put the link, so that's super. Thank you, Susan. And I don't see any more questions, so I see a comment from Irania, so thank you very much, and we appreciate that, and it's great to have everybody here with us. So let's talk about a little good news, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody. It's Thanksgiving week for those of you who are joining us in Canada, and it's been a different year for sure, but I think in the food industry we do have a lot of things to be thankful for as well, and it's one of the stories we wanted to share on the good news side is we see this from different retailers, but this is one I just wanted to highlight from Sweet Potato in Toronto, where they're doing a Thanksgiving dinner where our public health officials are still, especially where we're seeing a rise in some of the COVID-19 cases in certain parts of the country, where they're recommending that people really limit their Thanksgiving gatherings, which traditionally this would have been such a time of year for people to have a big family gathering. They're asking people to limit it. So we're seeing a lot of the food retailers put together special Thanksgiving dinners for one or for two, for smaller crowds, because we don't want to cook a big turkey if you're home with one or two people. So you can see where they're really trying to evolve and service a market who are looking for something and allow people to enjoy, you know, some of the tradition and you know, good things that come out of having a nice Thanksgiving dinner. So congratulations to Sweet Potato and other retailers who are doing the same thing. And it's not just them, but like I said, there are other retailers doing this. So also this week, congratulations to the winners from Seattle. I did log into Seattle and had a look around. I think there was maybe an opportunity to do even more. And I know that as everybody is trying to figure out new options about how they can be successful with online trade shows. I did see that there were some things in Seattle, but I think that hopefully as people get used to the technology that we'll see even more. But congratulations to the winners. They had a gold, silver, bronze. So gold was Art Kombucha, which is a gluten-free beer fermented with yeast and bacteria from kombucha. Then in their silver award winner was Ideal Aluminum's 100% compostable hot chicken containers. And if you saw the news in Canada, quite a big announcement today about single-use plastic coming out. So it's worth checking that out because it does impact the food industry, and probably we're going to see more to come. And then the bronze award winner from Seattle is LOC Industrial's vegan herbal butter. And I'm sure that you know, that we see those sections growing in the stores for sure. And then there also were a couple of innovation awards. So one of them went to La Fromagerie L'Ancêtre, who won for their organic prize in fresh foods category, which is an organic fondue made with organic L'Ancêtre cheese and organic Quebec beer from La Léon. And then also we had Top Glaciers won a special packaging prize for 6 organic sorbets offered in new recyclable packaging. So it's always interesting to see where the focus is in some of these awards. So you can see 2 out of 5 with packaging, one that's a vegan product, a kombucha, which we know is a growing hot category, and then also the organic product with the fondue. So always interesting to see, and congratulations to the winners there for their victory, I guess you would say. And I just see that there's something else in the chat. Jim is asking, is the event being recorded? So yes, we do record our recipes for success presented by FCC. We will send that out with the link in the follow-up email, so you should see that. And also another good news story from Hellmanns, and it's interesting. Hellmanns I'm sure you're familiar with their mayonnaise. It's part of Unilever, so part of a small, huge multinational company, but really position themselves as being concerned about food waste and trying to help. So what they did, which I thought was interesting, is they developed a piece to go into Nintendo's Animal Crossing. And it's a special island that was designed for Hellmanns. And the currency in Animal Crossing are different food products. And so what they did was the highest value food product in this Animal Crossing game from Nintendo are turnips. But if you don't use your turnips within a certain period of time, they spoil. So what Hellmanns did was they created a special island that had some focus around food waste and different things. But if you went during a special time, you could redeem those turnips. And for every turnip that was redeemed or spoiled, then they would donate a meal through Second Harvest Food Bank. So they were able to feed thousands of people because of people going in on a video game and turning in these spoiled turnips, and Unilever or Hellmann's turned this into a donation to Second Harvest. So I thought it was a really interesting, innovative way. They're trying to educate people about food service. And if you go on the Hellmann's website, actually, I'd never been there before, but because of this, I took a few minutes to just look at their website, and for a large multinational, they do have a fair amount. They're dedicated to reducing food waste and trying to help consumers with some tips and tricks to reduce food waste. So I thought it was interesting. It's certainly not the norm to see a large, sort of multinational CPG food company working with a Nintendo on a game, but it's innovative, and I think they're trying to get at a new group of consumers that perhaps they didn't reach before with some of their more traditional marketing. And our last good news, which is a different one for us to share, but if any of you were with us earlier in the spring, we had Carolyn Crew from Duckish with us for 4 weeks, and Carolyn did a fantastic job shedding some light on e-commerce and selling on Amazon, and she was very, very giving with her time to show us how the back end of her website for her business, Duckish, works. But I just wanted to share this. I thought this was fit in our good news category. So Duckish was selected along with 60 other unique entrepreneurs from across Canada to be included in Amazon's small business. And so they're featuring 60 entrepreneurs from across Canada, which are products that are sold on Amazon. And so congratulations to Carolyn for having Duckish featured there. And it's exciting to see these brands that we learn about and start to really grow and become more widely distributed. I know she's got her product on the shelf now in Sobeys in Atlantic Canada, and I think that hopefully there'll be some more exciting steps for her to take on the retail side as well. So I thought that was some good news as well to share. So congratulations to Carolyn for being selected to be part of that special offering from Amazon. So happy Thanksgiving from us at Skew Food. We do appreciate you being here with us every week, or as many weeks as you can, on our Recipes for Success, which are presented by FCC. And I do know your time is valuable, so thank you for being here. And if there are ever any questions or comments that you have, you can always get me at area code 902-489-2900, or you can send me an email, peter@skufood.com, and I'd be happy to get back to you and maybe learn something about your products and what you're doing. And we really hope you can join us next week for our session on, as we continue on the numbers. Today was gross margin versus markup, and next week we're going to talk about retail pricing and category margins and contribution margin, so you understand what the retailers are trying to do. So thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next week.